This story is titled, I, 35M, found a condom wrapper in my wife's 34F car, and now I can't stop questioning everything. Was our marriage ever real? Or has she been betraying me behind my back while I lived in blissful ignorance? For 10 years, Sarah and I had built a life together, 6 of those as husband and wife, and though we hadn't yet started a family, we had been on the verge of trying, planning for the future, imagining what our lives would look like as parents, and making all the necessary changes to prepare for that next chapter. Our relationship had always been solid, or at least, that's what I had believed. We were best friends first, the kind of couple who could spend hours talking about anything and everything, who laughed at the same jokes, who never seemed to run out of things to say. We had passion, we had trust, and we had a bond that I thought was unshakable. Sarah was stunning, the kind of woman who didn't have to try to be noticed. Long dark hair, sharp green eyes, a fit and toned figure from years of dedication to the gym, she was effortlessly beautiful. Me? I was average at best, but I never let that bother me because Sarah had chosen me, and for the longest time, I had believed that what we had went beyond just looks. We had always been active together, hitting the gym, eating clean, prioritizing our health. Sarah had always been more dedicated than I was, often staying longer, pushing herself harder, and making fitness a central part of her daily routine. It never bothered me. If anything, I admired her discipline. That was before I found the condom wrapper. It was a routine Saturday afternoon. I had been washing Sarah's car like I always did, scrubbing the exterior, vacuuming the seats, and clearing out any loose receipts or clutter from the interior. I had done this dozens of times, never expecting to find anything unusual. But when I reached under the passenger seat, my fingers brushed against something crinkled and small. I pulled it out, expecting a stray gum wrapper or an old receipt. It was an empty condom wrapper. My brain didn't register it at first. I just stared at it, my fingers tightening around the thin foil, my heart slamming against my ribs as the realization set in. Sarah and I didn't use condoms. We hadn't used them since the beginning of our relationship. She had been on birth control for years. We had been actively trying for a baby. There was no reason for this to be here. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind all at once, each one worse than the last. Had it been there for a long time? Was it old? No, that didn't make sense. I cleaned her car regularly, going through every inch of it at least once a month. If this had been there before, I would have found it. Had someone else borrowed her car? Maybe a friend? But Sarah never let anyone drive her car. She was particular about that, always preferring to be the one behind the wheel. Then the thought I had been avoiding hit me like a punch to the gut. What if this was recent? I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting as I tried to breathe through the sudden wave of nausea. Sarah spent a lot of time at the gym. 3, sometimes 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, staying late, taking extra classes, always pushing herself, always coming home exhausted. I'd never questioned it before, never even thought to. But now, every moment she had spent away from me, every extra hour at the gym, every time she came home and went straight to the shower, it all played back in my mind in slow motion, the pieces shifting into place in a way that made my chest tighten. I needed to believe there was a rational explanation, something that didn't involve betrayal, something that wouldn't unravel everything I had built my life around. But deep down, in the part of me that had always trusted her without hesitation, there was now a whisper of doubt, a nagging voice that I couldn't ignore. I clenched the wrapper in my fist, my hands shaking. Sarah was inside, probably sitting on the couch, completely unaware that my entire world had just tilted on its axis. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if I could trust the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. I had to confront her, but the thought of looking her in the eye and asking the question that could change everything made my stomach churn. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in circles, replaying every conversation, every moment, every sign I might have missed. She was my entire world. And yet, I knew, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much I wished I could turn back time and unsee what I had found, I needed the truth, even if it shattered me. The condom wrapper sat in my pocket like a dead weight, a small but undeniable piece of evidence that refused to let me rest, gnawing at the edges of my sanity, making every second I spent pretending everything was fine feel like an unbearable act of self-betrayal. I had spent the past 12 hours in complete turmoil, my thoughts circling the same question over and over. How do you ask the woman you love, the person you built your entire world around, if she has been unfaithful without completely shattering everything in the process? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't stay silent. That evening, as Sarah walked through the front door, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, her face glowing with that post-workout flush she always had, I found myself watching her in a way I never had before, scanning every detail, every movement, every flicker of expression, searching desperately for a sign, something that might confirm or contradict the sickening suspicion growing inside me. She smiled at me, the same easy, affectionate smile she had given me 1,000 times before, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I almost convinced myself that I was wrong, that there had to be an explanation, that the love we had built over the past 10 years wasn't something she could so easily throw away. But then I remembered the wrapper, and the doubt came crashing back. I waited until she'd settled in, until she was standing in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of water, her body relaxed, her mind elsewhere, completely unaware that I was about to throw a grenade into the middle of our lives. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the condom wrapper and placed it on the counter between us. Her reaction wasn't immediate. For a second, she just stared at it, her brows knitting together in confusion, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite form the words. Then she laughed. A soft, incredulous chuckle, the kind of laugh someone gives when they're caught off guard by something completely absurd, and the sound of it made my stomach turn because there was nothing funny about this. Nothing remotely humorous about the fact that I had spent the past day questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. "Are you serious?" she asked, shaking her head slightly, the corners of her mouth still tugging upward in amusement. What is this?" I didn't return her smile. "I found it in your car," I said, my voice tight, controlled, but barely masking the storm raging inside me. "Under the passenger seat." The amusement in her eyes faltered, her expression shifted, not to guilt, not to panic, but to something else, something I couldn't quite place. She reached for the wrapper, picking it up between her fingers, turning it over as if she needed to see it to believe it was real, her lips pressing into a thin line, her brows furrowing deeper. "I don't know what to tell you," she finally said, her voice calm, too calm. "I have no idea how this got there." I clenched my jaw, my patience wearing thin. "That's not good enough," I said, my words coming out sharper than I intended. "We don't use condoms, Sarah. You've been on birth control since we started dating. So tell me how this ended up in your car." Her eyes flickered just for a second. Was that hesitation, a moment of doubt? Then she exhaled through her nose and shrugged. "Maybe it's old," she offered. "Maybe it was from before we even got together, and it just—" "Don't," I cut in, shaking my head, feeling my pulse hammering in my skull. "I clean your car all the time. If it had been there before, I would have found it." Silence. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled, like she was realizing that this wasn't something she could just brush off, that I wasn't going to let it go, that no amount of nonchalant deflection was going to make me back down. "I don't know what you want me to say," she finally murmured, her voice softer now, like she was trying to tread carefully, as if she knew she was standing on dangerous ground. "I swear to you, I have no idea where it came from." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly, but something in my gut told me that this wasn't over, that this was only the beginning. The silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever, an unbearable, suffocating void between us, thick with tension and unspoken accusations. And no matter how many times I replayed the last few minutes in my mind, dissecting every word, every flicker of expression on her face, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong, that no matter how much she insisted she had no idea where the condom wrapper had come from, no matter how steady her voice was, no matter how casual she tried to appear, there was something beneath the surface, something I could feel more than I could see, a quiet, invisible shift in the foundation of our marriage, a crack that had begun to form, one that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. I watched her closely, trying to force myself to see her as a stranger might, to remove the years of love and trust and shared memories that clouded my judgment, to push aside the part of me that desperately wanted to believe that she was telling the truth, that she was just as confused as I was, that there was some kind of ridiculous, improbable, but ultimately innocent explanation for all of this, because the alternative, the possibility that she was lying, that she had betrayed me, that the life we had built together was no longer what I thought it was too much to bear. But no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, my gut refused to let me. That instinctive, primal voice inside me screaming that something wasn't adding up, that her reaction wasn't quite right, that the way she had laughed, the way she had brushed it off so casually, the way she had looked at me, not with shock or outrage or even fear, but with a measured sort of patience, like she was waiting for me to accept her answer rather than genuinely trying to convince me, all pointed to one thing. She was hiding something. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice even, controlled, despite the storm raging inside me. "Sarah," I said slowly, my fingers pressing into the counter, my knuckles turning white from the force of it. "I need you to be honest with me right now. I need you to tell me the truth. Because if there's something going on, If there's something you need to tell me, it's better if you just say it now. Her expression flickered. Just for a second, so quick I almost missed it. But it was there, a brief moment of hesitation, her eyes darting away from mine before she schooled her features back into neutrality, crossing her arms over her chest in that defensive way she always did when she felt cornered, when she felt like she was being accused of something she didn't want to admit to. And I knew, in that moment, that she was lying, that even if she wasn't outright confessing to anything, even if she wasn't saying the words, the truth was there, hanging in the air between us, waiting to be uncovered. "I don't know what else you want me to say," she murmured, her voice softer now, almost pleading, her fingers tracing small nervous circles on the surface of the countertop. "I've already told you everything I know. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it got in my car, and I don't appreciate being interrogated like this when I haven't done anything wrong." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to stay rational, even as frustration clawed at the edges of my patience, even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to push harder, to demand more, to make her tell me the truth. But I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere, that if she was hiding something, if she had already decided she wasn't going to tell me, then no amount of pressure or anger was going to change that, at least not right now. So instead, I stepped back, nodding once, a sharp, jerky motion that felt more like a physical manifestation of the battle raging inside me than an actual response. And then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, still holding the condom wrapper between her fingers like it was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, like she was just as confused as I was, except I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning in endless circles, retracing every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed, moments I'd overlooked, patterns that now seemed obvious in hindsight. And for the first time in my marriage, I didn't feel safe, didn't feel secure, didn't feel like I was lying next to the person I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with. I felt like I was lying next to a stranger. And I knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the suffocating darkness of our bedroom, listening to the steady rhythm of Sarah's breathing beside me, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was jumping to conclusions, that maybe, just maybe, she really didn't know where that condom wrapper had come from, there was something inside me, something raw, something instinctual, that refused to accept her answer, that refused to believe that this was just some weird coincidence, some harmless misunderstanding that could be explained away with enough rationalization. Because the truth was, trust isn't just about words, it's about feeling. And right now, I didn't feel right. I turned my head slightly, watching the soft rise and fall of Sarah's chest, the way her lips were slightly parted, the way she looked so peaceful, so utterly at ease, like she wasn't lying next to a man whose entire world had just been turned upside down, like she hadn't just spent the evening giving me the most lukewarm, half-hearted denial I had ever heard. And the longer I stared at her, the more I realized that I couldn't just let this go, that I couldn't just swallow my suspicions and move on like nothing had happened, because if I did, if I trusted her without proof, then I would never be able to look at her the same way again. I needed answers. And if she wasn't going to give them to me, I was going to find them myself. The next morning, I woke up early, long before Sarah, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could, my mind already racing with possibilities, with strategies, with all the ways I could go about figuring out the truth without tipping her off that I was even looking. I started with the easiest thing, her phone. She kept it on her nightstand, right where she always did, face down, the screen dark and lifeless. And as I stood there, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest, I felt a pang of guilt, because wasn't this exactly the kind of behavior that destroyed relationships? The sneaking, the paranoia, the invasion of privacy. But then, I remembered that condom wrapper, that sickening doubt that had been planted in my mind, and suddenly the guilt didn't seem so heavy anymore. I reached for the phone, careful not to make a sound, my fingers barely brushing against the smooth glass before the screen suddenly lit up with a notification. Missed call, unknown number. My stomach clenched. I glanced at Sarah, still asleep, still blissfully unaware. And without thinking, I swiped the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears as I navigated to her call log, scanning through the most recent entries, looking for anything unusual, anything out of place, anything that might explain why my gut was telling me that something was very, very wrong. And that's when I saw it. The same unknown number had called her 4 times in the past 3 days. No name, no saved contact, no indication of who it might be, just the same repeated number, like someone was trying to reach her, like someone was trying to get through to her and she wasn't answering. My throat tightened as I clicked on the number, my thumb hovering over the callback button. my brain at war with itself, one side screaming at me to put the phone down, to stop before I crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and the other side, the louder side, telling me that I had already crossed it, that I was already in too deep, that the only way forward now was through. But before I could press it, before I could do anything, I heard a groggy voice behind me. "What are you doing?" I spun around, nearly dropping the phone, my stomach twisting as I met Sarah's sleepy, slightly confused gaze, her brows furrowed as she propped herself up on one elbow, blinking at me in the dim morning light. I hesitated for only a second before forcing a casual shrug, holding up the phone like it was nothing, like I wasn't in the middle of something I had no business doing. "Your phone was buzzing," I said, my voice as neutral as I could make it. "You got a call from an unknown number." Her expression barely changed, just a flicker of something unreadable before she reached for the phone, taking it from my hand, glancing at the screen like she was only mildly interested. "Oh," she murmured, swiping the notification away before setting the phone back down on the nightstand. "It's probably just spam." My jaw tightened. "4 calls in 3 days?" I asked, keeping my tone light, nonchalant, even though my insides felt like they were twisting into knots. "That's a little persistent for spam, don't you think?" She let out a small breath, shaking her head as she pushed herself fully upright, rubbing her face like she was still trying to shake off sleep. "I don't know," she said, her voice exasperated now like she was already tired of this conversation. "I get random calls all the time. It's not a big deal." I didn't respond. I just nodded slowly, my mind racing because I could tell that she was lying. Maybe it was the way she had dismissed it so quickly, the way she had barely even looked at the number before brushing it off, the way her voice had changed just slightly, shifting into that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, but whatever it was, I knew. She was hiding something, and I wasn't going to stop until I found out what it was. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers drumming against the wood, my mind spiraling through every possibility, every potential explanation for the things I had uncovered, and yet no matter how many scenarios I tried to construct, no matter how much I attempted to rationalize, to find a version of events where Sarah wasn't lying to me, I kept arriving at the same place, the same dark, sinking realization that something was very, very wrong. Sarah moved around the kitchen like nothing was out of the ordinary, humming to herself as she made her usual morning smoothie, completely unaware, or maybe entirely too aware of the fact that I was sitting there watching her, analyzing every movement, every subtle shift in her expression, looking for a sign, a tell, anything that might confirm what my gut had already decided. That the woman I had trusted with my entire life, the woman I had spent a decade believing in, was keeping something from me. I cleared my throat, testing the weight of my words before I spoke. "So, you never answered me." Sarah paused, her hand tightening slightly around the blender lid, the smallest hesitation before she turned to look at me with carefully constructed confusion. "About what?" I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest, leveling my gaze at her. "The phone calls," I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. "You just brushed them off earlier, but 4 calls in 3 days doesn't sound like spam. It sounds like someone really wants to get in touch with you." Her lips pressed into a thin line, the muscles in her jaw tightening. "I told you," she said slowly, carefully, like she was choosing each word with precision. "I don't know who it is, and frankly, I don't see why you're making such a big deal about it." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You don't see why I'd be concerned?" I asked, my voice taking on an edge I hadn't intended but didn't bother to reel in. "Sarah, I found a condom wrapper in your car. We don't use condoms. Then I find out someone's been calling you repeatedly and you're acting like I'm crazy for wondering if there's a connection." Something flickered across her face, brief but unmistakable. Annoyance. She sighed heavily, setting her smoothie cup down on the counter with a little too much force. "This again?" she muttered, rubbing her temples like she was dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "I already told you I don't know where the wrapper came from. And as for the calls, maybe it's a telemarketer, maybe it's a wrong number, maybe it's a damn coincidence, but you know what isn't a coincidence? You suddenly deciding to go full-blown detective on me over nothing." My stomach twisted at the way she said that. Nothing. Like I was being irrational, like I was blowing things out of proportion, like I was the problem. I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back with a scrape against the floor. "So that's it?" I asked, my pulse hammering against my skull. "That's all you're going to say? No real explanation? No attempt to ease my concerns? Just dismissing it like I'm some paranoid lunatic?" Sarah threw up her hands, exasperation etched into every line of her face. "What do you want from me?" she snapped, her voice rising now, her patience wearing thin. "Do you want me to make something up just so you feel better? Because I can't. I don't have an answer, because there is no answer. You're looking for something that isn't there. I clenched my fists, staring at her, willing myself to see the truth, to push past the gaslighting, past the deflection, past the way she was trying to twist this around on me. But I didn't need to push any further, because I already knew. I knew that if she were innocent, if she truly had nothing to hide, she wouldn't be acting like this. She wouldn't be deflecting, she wouldn't be minimizing, she wouldn't be getting defensive and irritated and shifting the blame onto me like I was the one tearing our marriage apart. She would be upset. She would be hurt that I even had doubts. She would prove to me that she had nothing to hide, but instead she was standing there, looking at me with barely concealed frustration, as if I was the one creating the problem, as if I was the one ruining what we had. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't me overreacting. This was real. And the worst part? She wasn't even trying to stop me from believing it. I let out a slow, controlled breath, nodding to myself as the decision solidified in my mind. All right, I said, stepping back, my voice eerily calm. If that's the case, then I need some time to think. Sarah's brows furrowed. Think about what? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my chest tight. About whether or not I can trust you. Her mouth opened, then closed again, her eyes searching mine, but I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing in the kitchen, leaving behind the life I thought we had, leaving behind the woman I wasn't sure I even knew anymore. Because sometimes the hardest part about discovering the truth isn't the discovery itself. It's realizing that the person you love isn't going to fight to keep you from walking away. I drove without knowing exactly where I was going, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding against my ribs in a dull, relentless rhythm that echoed the single, unshakable truth circling my mind. There was no coming back from this, no undoing what had been done, no salvaging the wreckage of what had once been my marriage. Because no matter how much Sarah tried to pretend that there was still something left to fight for, no matter how many empty reassurances she offered, no matter how carefully she measured her words, refusing to admit outright what I already knew, the reality of her betrayal had settled deep into my bones, and I could feel it there, heavy and cold, an undeniable weight that I would never be able to ignore or forget or explain away. Because once trust is broken in this way, once the doubt takes root, it never truly leaves. And even if I wanted to pretend otherwise, even if I wanted to be the kind of man who could forgive, who could push past the unbearable sting of knowing that the person he had loved, the person he had built a life with, had chosen to lie, to deceive, to betray, I wasn't that man, and I never would be. I thought about turning back, about confronting her one last time, about demanding that she give me something real, something tangible, something that would make sense of all of this, because even though I had all the pieces in front of me, even though I had spent the past 24 hours slowly piecing together the puzzle of her infidelity, even though the unknown number had practically confirmed everything without needing to be spelled out, there was still a part of me, deep down, buried beneath the anger and the hurt and the overwhelming exhaustion, that needed to hear her say it, needed her to look me in the eye and admit what she had done, because maybe then I could finally put this to rest. Maybe then I could walk away without feeling like I had left something unfinished, like there was still a question hanging in the air between us, unanswered, but I knew, God, I knew, that I would never get that Sarah would never admit to anything, not because she was innocent, but because she was cowardly, because she would rather let me spiral, let me drive myself insane questioning what was real and what wasn't, rather than face the truth head on and say the words that would finally destroy whatever fragile thread was still holding our marriage together. So I kept driving, past the familiar streets that had once felt like home, past the places that had been ours, our favorite coffee shop, the park where we used to take long walks on Sundays, the little bookstore where she had spent hours browsing through shelves while I stood beside her, pretending to be interested in things I didn't care about just because I loved watching the way her face lit up when she found something new. And I realized with a sudden, crushing clarity that all of it was tainted now, that every memory, every moment, every place that had once been sacred to us had been irreversibly altered. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run from the truth, I would never be able to escape the fact that the life I had built, the love I had nurtured, had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, one that had shattered in an instant, leaving me with nothing but the empty, echoing silence of what used to be. I ended up at my mother's house, not because I had planned to, not because I had consciously decided that this was where I needed to be, but because in the absence of everything else, in the absence of the home that no longer felt like mine, this was the only place that still felt safe. the only place that hadn't been touched by the storm that had consumed my life in the span of a single day. And as I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me with suffocating intensity, I barely made it to the front door before she opened it, as if she had been waiting for me, as if she knew, even without me saying a single word, that something was wrong, that I was unraveling, that I had reached the edge of something I couldn't come back from. She didn't ask me why I was there. She didn't press me for answers. She just pulled me into a hug, her arms wrapping around me in a way that made my chest tighten, made my throat close up, made me feel, for the first time in what felt like years, like I didn't have to hold it together, like I didn't have to pretend I was fine. And for a long time, I just stood there, breathing her in, letting the familiarity of her presence ground me, letting myself feel the weight of everything without trying to push it down or bury it beneath forced composure. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us. And then, finally, after what felt like forever, I pulled back, exhaling a shaky breath, and said the only words that mattered anymore. It's over. She nodded, her eyes searching mine, seeing everything I wasn't saying, understanding without needing an explanation. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but certain, carrying none of the false reassurance or empty platitudes I'd been dreading. I'm proud of you. And maybe that shouldn't have meant anything. Maybe it shouldn't have carried the weight that it did. But in that moment, after everything, after all the doubt and the questions and the pain, it was the only thing I needed to hear, because it was a reminder that I had done the right thing, that I had chosen myself, that I had walked away from something that no longer served me, no longer deserved me. And even though it hurt, even though it would take time, even though I knew there would be nights where I lay awake questioning everything, I also knew, deep down in the part of me that had always known the truth, even when I didn't want to admit it, that I was going to be okay. Because I had survived the worst of it. Because I had walked away from the wreckage. Because I had chosen me.